Chapter 18. Jonah hadn't known what to expect at the bottom of that long shaft into the earth. Nessa had tried to tell him, haltingly, but it was clear there was just something she couldn't manage to tell him, something that horrified her exhausted little soul. It might have been only the terrors of a little girl lost, but whatever it was, just her expression had made the hair stand up on the back of his neck. So he'd exchanged his service weapon, a Glock 22, for the .44 Magnum he kept more as a showpiece, but also kept clean and oiled, and used at the shooting range whenever he used his service weapon. The only one of the others to comment had been Samantha, who had said merely, "Looks like that cannon DeMarco carries." "It kicks like a mule," was all Lucas said. "I'll say," Sarah agreed, checking the load on her own Glock. "I fired the damn thing once at the range and it knocked me on my ass. I don't need anything that powerful." "Probably depends on what you're aiming at," Robbie murmured, envying the other woman her almost preternatural calm. Sarah looked fairly rested, having logged probably a couple hours more sleep than Dante and Robbie, and she was most definitely ready to move, now that Nessa was safe and it seemed at least even odds they were going to find the others as well. Safe and unharmed, they hoped. They were all suited up in their body armor and armed, but they didn't ride horses to meet the other two officers. Instead, Jonah's Jeep was joined by 4 others from the police motor pool, and they loaded up and headed out in those. Thunder rumbled about the time they turned off a paved road and onto a rutted track, and it was Samantha who asked, "Did anybody check the weather?" Jonah, who was driving their Jeep in the lead, replied, "The worst of it's supposed to hold off except for the wind. But sometime after midnight we're going to get slammed." There were still enough dead leaves from the winter past to be blowing across in front of them, and Jonah had the Jeep's running lights on, which helped more and more as the rutted road disappeared and he appeared to be following no more than a wide space between trees. "I can see how you wouldn't have to worry about kids coming out here," Samantha said. "Spooky as hell. I know there's a storm rumbling around, but still." "This used to be fairly good riding on horseback," he told her, "but the undergrowth got out of control and nobody wanted to keep up the trails. Land's owned by a billionaire who also owns 4 or 5 mountains in the general area, and to his credit, he wants to keep them wild. Hiking or riding is fine, but no lumber and no development." "Good for him," Sam said. "Yeah, I more or less agree with him, but a few hundred acres of this wilderness fall within my area of responsibility, so I'm really not keen on hikers or riders out this way." "Unless you send them," Sam murmured as the headlights illuminated 2 clearly relieved uniformed police officers who had their horses tied to trees just off the track. They were holding flashlights, and it was easy to see that they'd been waving them around nervously until they saw the lights of vehicles approaching. Jonah had gone over the plan with everyone, and everyone knew their part. There was no exit from this hole in the ground except the one they were going into. They waited at the opening for just a couple of minutes with Jonah and the other feds watching Sam. She swore under her breath but said to Jonah, "No booby traps, no bombs." "Sam?" She looked at her husband and partner briefly, then said to Jonah bleakly, "Go ahead and get EMS out here as quickly as you can. We'll need 5 stretchers." "And 5 coffins?" Jonah asked steadily. No, they're alive. Let's go." He gave the order quickly, sending 2 officers back with one of the Jeeps to guide the EMS truck into the woods. The first half dozen people going in, which were Jonah, Sarah, and the agents all had the big police spotlights that could be carried and gave off an amazing amount of light. They turned them on as soon as they started into the downward slanting tunnel. But within a very few steps, one by one, they turned the lights off, because there was light at the bottom of the tunnel. Bright, bright light. "It's not a fire," Lucas breathed, "which means he wants us, you, to see his work." "Oh, Christ," Jonah murmured. "It isn't what you think," Sam said. "He didn't physically torture them any more than he physically tortured Nessa." Then Jonah broke off as soon as he cleared the tunnel and stepped into the cavern. It wasn't huge, maybe 30 feet from end to end and about 20 feet across. The lights had been placed with exquisite care so that each of the missing people, watering eyes shut tight against the first light any of them had seen since they'd been brought here, weeks for some of them, were the inescapable focus. Each of them sitting, unrestrained but unmoving, on upright wooden chairs, an IV pole beside each chair, the tubing from the bag snaking down and attached to the needles expertly placed in each victim's arms, unmoving, unable to move. Their pants and shorts or panties down around their ankles, and beneath them, fastened to the chairs they could not escape, were pots or bowls or buckets to catch their urine and feces. "Oh my gosh," Jonah said, his voice hardly a whisper. Lucas leaned over to say something to Sarah, and she immediately turned and began to herd the officers back up the tunnel. "We'll need you later to help carry them," she said, her voice breaking a little, but not yet, not just yet. "People always find new ways to torture each other," Sam said. "Physically is the easy part, but mentally, emotionally, how do you get over being abandoned in the darkness? Unable to move or speak, even to call for help? How do you get over being so helpless that someone else has to empty? How do you get over that humiliation, that loss of dignity? How do you get over being so alone and so untouched for so long? Alone, in the dark." There was a moment of utter silence, and then they could all hear Amy Grimes mumbling to herself nothing that made sense. Nothing that would ever make sense. "Let's get some of these lights out," Lucas suggested quietly. "Leave just enough for the medics to work by, and don't break them. All these people have bare feet." Jonah did his best not to look at them directly as the level of light gradually diminished, but he eventually realized that none of them were going to open their eyes willingly. Not even Sean Messina, who had been taken barely a week before Nessa had. None of them wanted to open their eyes even if they could. None of them wanted to believe in the voices they probably thought were imagined. None of them had it in them any longer to believe there could be anything else for them, ever, but the darkness. With both hands holding the hot coffee cup on the conference table in front of him, Dante said, "Nessa's the only real survivor." His voice was dull. "She wasn't down there long enough, and she found her way out of the dark on her own. That will count. That will mean something to her someday in the future, if not now." Jonah looked across the table at the two most experienced profilers here. They were all here, the feds and Sarah, all with coffee they'd barely touched, and eyes that didn't want to meet anyone else's. Every one of them had helped carry the stretchers up that long, dark tunnel, only then accepting the silent, respectful help of the officers waiting outside. Jonah said, "I know enough about profiling to know it's about damaged people and the reasons people have inside them that give them the ability to damage others. So tell me, how many of the 5 survivors we brought out of that place are going to have lives worth living? Sam was the first to meet his eyes, her own so dark as they'd been when he'd first met her, dark and unspeakably old in her urchin's pale face. She drew a breath and said, Mrs. Lang's baby may help her. The maternal instinct is strong enough to overcome almost anything. Amy Grimes is young, and the young are resilient. It depends on how strong her sense of self is. That's true of all of them, but the judge is never going to be the man you once knew, Jonah. He was a man of dignity, and he can never see himself that way again. If he even leaves the clinic, it'll likely be to go to some kind of mental care facility, or at least a residential medical care facility. Maybe Sean Messina too. His sense of self seemed to be very wrapped up in being strong, independent, able to handle himself and whatever else came along. But he couldn't handle what happened to him. Even the ones that somehow managed to move on, even Nessa, will be marked forever by what they experienced down in that hole in the ground. Because of me. She shook her head immediately. No, because of someone with a sick and twisted mind who wanted to make you suffer, and not just by a blow dealt and then over with. What do you mean? He knows you, Jonah. He knows how you feel about this town, these people, especially these people. You saved them. Every one of them owed their life to you. Jonah started to speak, but didn't when she held up a hand. This is important. This is why everything has happened the way it has. He wants you to suffer. He wants you to spend the rest of your life suffering because of what happened to these people. And even wondering if they would have been better off if you hadn't saved them in the first place. Blaming yourself for what happened to them for the rest of your life. That's what he wants, Jonah. That's what he needs. Lucas nodded. She's right. Jonah finally took a drink of his coffee. Vaguely aware that he had the wrong order. It was too sweet. Not that he cared. I honestly can't think of anyone who could hate me that much. That's because he doesn't hate you, Luke said. What? All that, and he doesn't hate me? If he hated you, Robbie said slowly, it would have been you down there. She glanced at Luke, who nodded. Exactly. He doesn't want to torture you. He wants to watch you torture yourself. I still don't think, Samantha urged. He isn't someone on the periphery of your life the way we originally thought. At least he wasn't always. He looked up to you somehow, admired you. But then something happened. Something happened to him, just like it happened to those 6 other people. Only for whatever reason you didn't save him. Maybe you couldn't, or maybe you made a choice and saved somebody else. Think, Jonah, you know who this is. Whatever happened to him was so traumatic, it turned a normal man into a monster, and he blames you. Sarah caught her breath audibly. Jonah. You know who it is? She looked at him, white-faced. You said it yourself, that maybe you shouldn't have gotten him out of there because of all the pain. Months and months in the burn ward out in Nashville. Horrible, disfiguring scars. And then it was Sam who asked what happened then. He survived the burns. Sarah was looking at Jonah as if she couldn't look away. One of the few really bad car crashes we've had here, 5 years ago. Sebastian Geddes. He was driving too fast and missed a curve, swerved, hit a culvert, and the car flipped. He'd been on his way home to cut the grass, and he had a can of gasoline in the back, a can with a loose lid, and the car had a faulty wire, one they'd recall the model for just the next year. The fire, it was an inferno. We could hear the fire truck coming, but he was screaming. Sarah closed her eyes briefly. I can still hear that screaming sometimes in my mind. You couldn't stand it. You grabbed a big wrench from your Jeep and somehow pulled the door open. He must have managed to get the seatbelt undone, but he was still screaming, beating at the flames. You had a blanket ready, Jonah said numbly. We covered him and smothered the flames. I'll never forget that horrible smell of burned flesh. And I'll never forget when the EMS tech looked at him. You just knew that I should have let him die, Jonah said. Your hands were bandaged for weeks, Sarah said. Jonah looked down at strong hands, unmarked, and said, surface burns, and I never scar. I didn't have a mark on me, but Bast. Sam waited a moment, then asked, when did he come back to Serenity? About a year ago, Jonah answered. I went to see him, but he made it plain he really didn't want company. The car company had settled a fortune on him, took care of all his hospital bills, set him up in a nice house just on the edge of town with a great view, and a live-in caretaker. Because of the burns, Sam asked. Some of his fingers had fused. Jonah was still looking down at his own hands. It was difficult for him to do some things, so she cooked and did the housekeeping. Supposed to keep him company, but he didn't want her hovering. He could walk fine, even though he limped, and sometimes at night he'd walk around, places he knew he wouldn't run into anybody else. He said he didn't need anybody else. He said he liked the night. He felt normal in the dark. Lucas knew there was more. Something else happened, didn't it, to Bass? Something that was unfair? Something recent? A stressor, Samantha said, a final straw, something that set him off. Some people just have the worst luck, Jonah said slowly, the worst. He fell one day about 4 months ago, just lost his balance and fell. So his caretaker called the doctor over his objections. Within days, he was back in Nashville for more tests. When he fell silent, Sarah said we probably wouldn't have known until the end if Bass had his way. But the doctors here had to know, and his caretaker. It was an inoperable tumor in his brain. They gave him 6 months. He didn't want anyone feeling sorry for him. And people did tend to avoid him if they could, because there were changes right away, small at first. Losing his temper, muttering to himself as he walked. We all tried to talk to him, but he'd just walk away into the dark. Jonah drew in a deep breath and let it out slowly. I saved his life so he could spend years in a hell of agony and then die with cancer eating at his brain. You couldn't have known, Sarah said. I don't think that's much of an excuse, Jonah said. Samantha leaned forward, elbows on the table. Jonah, whatever happened to him, whatever he went through because you pulled him from a burning car, he went through because you weren't prepared to let him die without trying to save him. There's nothing wrong in that. It's one of the best instincts any human being can possess. Tell that to the 6 people he punished for it. He didn't punish them for that, Sam said. Jonah frowned at her. You saved those 6 people and their lives were just fine. They were alive because of you. He was alive because of you. But then he got cancer. She shook her head. A doctor would know better, but I'm guessing where the cancer is, its location in his brain, is the reason why it's affected him the way it has. He needed someone to blame. He wanted someone to suffer. And while he was dealing with all that, he discovered that the tumor in his brain had given him something special, a final gift from a mocking fate. He was psychic, Jonah said. Bass had thought it would be enough to watch Jonah suffer. He knew Jonah had suffered, was probably still suffering, but that wasn't really what he was thinking about now. Things kept getting mixed up in his mind. He wasn't even sure why he tried to make the telepath kill her partner, except maybe he was jealous? No. Beauty and the Beast, that was just a fairy tale. But whenever he touched her mind, he felt so much power he didn't think even she was aware of. He wondered if maybe she could heal him. If all that power she had could burn away this cancer growing in his brain before his skull burst open like an overripe melon. It felt like that sometimes. The pressure, the pain, the almost overwhelming urge to find a knife or a chisel and dig it all out of his brain. Maybe she could do that. Maybe she was the answer to his prayers. Lucas said brain tumors have been known to trigger psychic abilities, but it isn't a normal trigger, for want of a better word. Instead of concentrating the ability, a tumor can disperse or diffuse it. It's unreliable, even more so than usual with a new psychic. It can be erratic, like a light bulb getting brighter just before it burns out. He was able to control 6 people, Jonah said. Control is probably too strong a word. It's more like he sent a jolt of power into each of their minds. The initial jolts allowed him to control them just for a few minutes, just long enough. Once he had them down in that cavern, I think he gave them another jolt and drugs in those IVs, not just nutrients. The doctors will know more once they've run tox screens, but I'm betting that's how he kept them still without having to tie them. There are drugs that do that, keep the body completely immobile, but the mind alive, aware, and slowly going crazy. What about Nessa? I had a look at her chart. Her pediatrician noted that she had an unusually high metabolism. Probably never caused her a health problem in her life, and she'll stay enviably slim no matter what she eats. But she'll also react unpredictably to most medications. Her doctor advised caution and observation whenever she was given anything she'd never taken before. My bet is that her body reacted differently to the drug he used. She realized she could move, just as she told you. And when she thought the time was right, that he wasn't down there with them anymore, she felt her way out. There was a long silence, and then Dante said, "We'll have to bring him in, arrest him. He killed Annie Duncan, held the others prisoner, and most likely destroyed at least a few of those lives." "Yeah," Jonah said. "I doubt he'll serve any time," Lucas said. "If he's as sick as I think he is, he'll probably be sent to a critical care hospital and die there even before charges could be brought against him." Or maybe not. They all nearly jumped out of their skins at the new voice, and yet froze at the same time. Because somehow he had slipped behind one of the evidence boards, and now he was behind Dante, hauling him up from his chair. He had a gun pointed at Dante's carotid, and Bast Geddes was indeed a monster. His face was hideously deformed, one ear gone, and the other hardly a twisted lump. His discolored head was bald with ropes of scar tissue, and the lack of eyebrows made him look vaguely surprised. More ropey scarring twisted around his face and neck and disappeared beneath his shirt. The arm he held across Dante's neck and upper chest was the one with fingers fused. His other hand seemed perfectly comfortable holding the gun at Dante's neck. Bast, I'm the one you want. Jonah had managed to turn his chair just a bit, but he didn't want to rise until he had to, since it was impossible to hide the big silver gun he still wore. Well, I thought you were, Bast said in a reasonable tone. His head so close to Dante's that it would have been difficult to slide a piece of paper between them. I planned it all out, and it worked. I got the ones I wanted. The other ones you saved. I put them in a dark hole they'll never get out of, even if you carried their bodies out. Then you have your revenge, Bast. Revenge? It was never about revenge, Jonah. It was about fairness. You saved them, and they were all fine. They were living good lives. You saved me, and I am, a monster. But even that wasn't unfair enough. I had to be something worse. So then I got cancer. I got this horrible black thing eating at my brain. Does that sound fair to you, Jonah? Dante spoke suddenly. Sounds like life to me. Fair, unfair. We all get our share sooner or later, in this life or the next. Dante, Robbie said in a warning tone. What do you think, Bast? Dante asked. Do you think killing my friends will even the score? Do you think that'll make your cancer and your scars disappear? I think she can, the telepath. I think she can make the cancer go away. I can see into her mind a little, and I think she can. The only thing they could all agree on afterward was that everything happened at once. There was a boom of thunder so loud it shook the building. The lights flickered. They could all see Dante reaching for Bast's gun, all of them knowing he would never make it before that tightening finger pulled the trigger. All of them were rising from the table, most reaching for their guns. But Robbie held out one hand, stretching it toward the monster who was going to kill Dante. There was another crash of thunder, this one accompanied by a bright flash of lightning. That was what everyone said. That Jonah's big silver gun bucked in his hand just a split second, after Bast blew a horribly big hole in Dante's neck. That Dante was falling boneless to the floor, his wide eyes already sightless, as Robbie stretched out her hand even farther and cried out in anguish, "No!" And no one in the room said it might have been something other than Jonah's shot that took away Bast Geddes' cancer for good. His cancer and his scarred face and head, because it just exploded like an overripe melon.